Hi, all. I'm very excited to be speaking here today at AxCon 2022. I'm Deb Mayers, and my talk is entitled XR Accessibility. Can we do that? All thoughts and opinions expressed in this presentation are my own. Please feel free to reach out to me at dmayers340@gmail.com. Have a look at my website at debmayers.com or on Twitter at debmayers24. And I'm also on LinkedIn. You just search for Deb Mayers as well. I'm always happy to talk about AR, VR, accessibility, or ancient history. So do please reach out. And before we start our topic today, let's first define what XR is. So there is a big question in the industry in immersive technologies about what we should call ourselves. I quite like XR, where the X is kind of an unknown variable. We have augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, hyper reality, the list goes on. Some people use XR for extended reality as well, but it all falls under this very broad umbrella that we're going to call XR. The two main components that we're going to be focusing on today are augmented reality, where there are some digital content that's placed inside the real world. This digital content could be something like a visual of a tiger placed on the floor. And actually, if you Google tiger right now, you can actually try it out by placing a tiger in your real world. And it can also be something where you use sounds and haptics to localize this extra bit of information. AR is just some type of digital content placed on top of the physical world. And inside of that, we also have mixed reality. Now, mixed reality is where that digital content that's placed in the physical world is actually spatially aware. So this means that tiger that you're looking at can actually understand where your environment is and walk around your room without running into a wall. Or if someone walks in front of the tiger, it still stays behind that person. So that's augmented and mixed reality. So that is our digital content in the physical world. Now, virtual reality is a 3D generated space. This is what we have as fully immersive visuals, sounds, haptics, and they're typically added together to help the user have an illusion that they're somewhere else. So AR and VR are mainly what we're going to talk about today in our XR term. So now that we have these definitions, let's go ahead and get started. Today, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, give you the TLDR, or the too long didn't read, essentially a summary of today's topic. And then we'll dive into the accessibility of augmented and virtual reality, creating accessible experiences now, and then in the future, before we dive into our Q&A. So a little bit about me. I am an XR software engineer and an accessibility technologist. I've been in the XR industry for 6 years, and I'm currently focused on enterprise adoption of technology, as well as the use of technology in museums and in education. I also have 3 years of accessibility experience. By this, I was helping designers, developers, and testers incorporate accessibility into their project workflow, as well as helping people understand what the WCAG is and how to make products accessible for people with disabilities. I also have a master's in ancient cultures and a master's in information technology or software development, where I did my dissertation using virtual reality to see if we could actually learn about the past using VR. And on the screen, we have an image of my dissertation, which is the virtual reality experience I did about the temple to Mithras on Hadrian's Wall at Karbroth. In the image, we are facing the apse, where the standard image of Mithras slaying, or what we now think he is wounding, a bull, is placed above 3 altars. Now, when I started doing this experience, it really got me started thinking more in depth about AR and VR. And one of the coolest projects I've been doing lately is using augmented reality in museums to help people understand how to learn ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. So I just started learning how to read hieroglyphs, and I love AR. So combining those two together has been one of my favorite things to do. Now, that's me in a nutshell. Let's go into the harder part of my job, which is trying to make AR and VR accessible. So the too long didn't read of this is, yes, we can add some bits of accessibility into XR experiences, but the current technology has inherent limitations. Specifically, we're speaking about things like the weight of the headset and the addition of input and output devices like assistive technologies. At the moment, it's very complicated to plug in adaptive controllers, Bluetooth keyboards, and I'm not aware of any headsets that have a built-in screen reader. So now you know this very brief overview. Let's go and dive a little bit more into what we need to know to create an XR application. So before we create any XR application, we have a lot to think about. We need to figure out, are we going to do AR, VR, mixed reality, a mix of all of them? Do we want it to be interactive, a 360 video, a model viewer? Should it be web-based? And if so, do we want to use technologies like the eighth wall, A-Frame, ARJS, React XR, Babylon? Or should we do a native application using Unreal, Unity, AR Core, ARKit? And of course, once we decide if it's AR or VR, interactive or not, a web or a native app, we have to look into what platform we want to use. And that's even more fragmented than what we just talked about. We have things for AR, such as using our phones, so we can use Apple or Android. We can also do something that's web-based, or use something like the HoloLens, or Magic Leap, or Unreal headsets. And if we want to do something in virtual reality, we could use something like the Oculus, the Vive, the Varho, do something web-based, use Windows Mixed Reality. And all of these are going to have their own accessibility considerations. So if you're confused at the moment, don't worry. It is very confusing. But we do have some things that are making things easier. So something like OpenXR, which isn't adopted by all of the technologies yet, but hopefully soon it will be. And it'll make our development process much more streamlined. And it'll also help with our interoperability. So now that we know all of this confusing mess of AR and VR, let's talk about the accessibility of it. Now, when we think about XR as a solution, the first thing we want to do is look into our users. So inside of our users, we have a variety of backgrounds. And one thing I want to point out is that what I have here does not encompass all users. And all I have is just a small sampling. I've tried to include users with permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities in each category. So, for example, under the audio category, we could have people who are deaf, people who are hard of hearing, people who are in an arcade. It's very noisy there, or in a museum, or in a quiet place without headphones. People with cognitive disabilities, such as anxiety, depression, dyslexia, autism, ADHD, or someone who's distracted, or someone using XR for pain therapy. And then we also have people who might be having mobility disabilities, or people who get motion sickness, or people who have kids or pets at home. And remember when I talked about someone who is distracted? They could be distracted while a kid is running around them, and they could trip if they're using a virtual reality headset, which blocks out their view. So we also have people who have small living spaces. And then we also want to think about people who are blind, people with low vision, people who are using augmented reality in a sunny area, and it's really hard to see their screen, or people who have eye strain from playing in a VR or mixed reality headset. And for all of these, the categories can mix together. So we want to make sure that we are making our experiences as accessible as we can. But how do we even do that? Well, the very first thing we need to do is start looking at inclusion. This is a very critical step. We need to design with people with disabilities and not for people with disabilities. People with disabilities need to be involved at every stage in our development process, from ideation to design, development, testing, and maintenance. It's going to be crucial that we include. Then the next thing we need to do is to use our senses. Now, depending on which theory you subscribe to, there's anywhere between 5 and 53 senses. I like to just keep it to the 7 listed here. So we have visual, oral or hearing, haptics or touch, scent, taste, vestibular, which is knowing about movement and balance and understanding where the body is in space, and also proprioception, which is understanding where the body parts are in relation to each other, which allows us to do things like clap or give us an idea of how much force to use, like when we're breaking an egg for our omelet in the morning. Now, some people may not be able to see something, but when the audio and haptics give the same information, they can still perceive it. Likewise, someone might not be able to hear something in an experience, but when the noise is shown visually or with haptics, they can also perceive it. And of course, the best way to know how to include these senses is to check out some of the guidelines that are available. There's currently the XRA Developer Guidance, specifically Chapter 3, which has a lot of great resources inside of it. And there's also XR Access resource page, which just has a ton of great links to check out. There's the W3 groups, and there's also the Oculus virtual reality checks. And we have Pete, who just released their Inclusive Hybrid Work Toolkit, and Equal Entry, who's been doing a lot of work on blogging things with people with disabilities who are using virtual and augmented reality experiences, as well as doing their own tests. And lastly, we need to get involved in some of these communities. So the AR/VR accessibility space is currently rather small, so you'll see a lot of crossover of people in between all of the groups. So some of the ones that I really recommend joining are XR Access, or XRSI, or the XR Safety Initiative, the A11Y VR Meetup, and the W3 groups of like immersive captioning and inclusive design for immersive web. And getting involved in these communities will really help us to understand how people are using technology and how best to grow the technology. So now that we know all of this, let's talk a little bit about creating accessible experiences today. At the moment, we're really in this phase of research and experimentation. There's a lot of progress that's being made out there. Even big release titles like Vacation Simulator or Beat Saber have been doing accessibility updates. So right now is the perfect time to get involved and ask the question, how can we do 3D content descriptions or alt text? How do we do captioning? How can we do alternative ways of moving in XR experiences? How can we use XR as an assistive technology? How can we do things that we haven't even thought of yet? Because this new technology is going to allow us to do many more things than a flat 2D screen. One of the best use cases I've seen lately is using augmented reality for visual search, which allows people with low vision to be able to find what they're looking for in something like a grocery store in so much less time than it does currently. So there's a lot of research and experimentation going on right now. And of course, even though there is this, we still have some very high-level guidelines that we can follow. So let's talk about visual guidelines first. So some of the things we want to do is like display text on a background and at a suitable distance, no closer than 0.5 meters away, which allows for an easy reading experience. We want to make sure that we have descriptions on our environment or our room, as well as in our 3D objects in the room, because the user needs to know where they are and what is in front of them. We want to make sure that we have color contrast. Now, I know that currently the WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, states that you can have a 3:1 for some things, but I honestly wouldn't recommend doing that inside of virtual or augmented reality. I'd make sure the contrast is at least 4.5:1, because it's a very busy background. You're going to be placing content on reality. Having that higher contrast is going to be crucial. So we also want to think about things like text size and typography and allowing the users to change this. So inside of this, we also want to think about just how easy it is to do. A lot of these things that we're talking about today are actually going to just be a settings toggle. So we can change our text size and typography by just using a drop-down or by just changing a slider. We also want to make sure that we're limiting flashing and blinking content and having a way to turn off background noises and content. The user should be able to tell you what they can and they can't do inside of there. So we want to make sure that we can turn off that flashing and blinking content or any extra noise. We also want to make sure that interactable objects are large enough and that there's a non-visual way to know about interaction. So something like having a haptic feedback as you're placing your hand over an object. We also want users to be able to change the verbosity of our audio and a time delay. We want to make sure that we use audio descriptions. So we can have things like a normal audio description, a verbose one, where users might want to hear much more information, or a really quick one. And we want to make sure that there's some sort of time delay of when to speak. So that way users are able to go at their own pace. Or you can also use someone guiding someone in an experience. Next, for audio, we want to make sure that important sounds are displayed with text and or haptic. Users should be able to control how they want to perceive the audio. We want to make sure that our captions are displayed appropriately. And users should be able to customize their captions. For example, the font size, the color, how many lines, the verbosity, and the location of the caption. And we can also start thinking about sign language inside of VR and AR because we now have hand tracking. And we also want to make sure that we have transcripts available for users. And one thing that I keep coming back to is I wonder if we can use haptics for Braille. If anyone's done any research on this, please reach out to me. I would love to hear about that. We also want to have some sort of setting to change from mono audio to spatial audio and to change the volume of our background noise and our speaking noises. Now, the next one is for mobility guidelines. We want to make sure that we have an accurate scale of a user, where we can also reset our camera height and our arm length. Whenever I'm inside of a public transit, like an airplane, when I put on my VR headset, it's really difficult to use because I can't always change how much room I have inside of that space. So we want to be mindful of that. We also want to make sure that we have seated, standing, and room scale configurations. We want to make sure that we can move our camera position with just our controllers or another device that goes in. We want multiple inputs. So things like keyboards, controllers, hands, eyes, voice, switch devices, and BCI or brain computer interfaces. We want to support lots of inputs because people aren't always going to be able to use the same one. We also want to make sure that we have a good target size for our interactive objects. So that way, if someone's hand is shaking while they're going through, they don't have to make sure that they're right on the object. They can go a little bit off. And we want to make sure that we have a one-handed mode and allow the users to choose their handedness. So I hope you can see in all of these guidelines that a lot of it is just about making sure that the user has their own choices. So this brings us into what we need for the future. And how do we create accessible XR experiences in the imagined future? Well, the first thing is we're going to need it to be a lot easier to go cross-platform. I'm sure if you remember from the beginning, we had a lot of different things to think about when we're creating an AR or VR experience. Making something that is able to go cross-platform needs to be very seamless. Then we want the accessibility to be built into our experiences. We want accessible hardware, making sure that the assistive technology is built on the device, or it's easy to add an assistive technology or something else into your experience to allow you to customize it to the way that you can use it. And we do want some things like automatic user customization. So if I say globally on my headset that I want just a sitting experience, that should go across any other experience that I have. Or if I say I need to have a 50-point text size, that should go everywhere as well. We want users to be able to customize their room scale, standing, sitting, locomotion preferences, to allow users to change the experience to suit their needs and to have that across all experiences. And in order to do this, we really need some strong guidelines for design, development, and testing. And hopefully, while we're making all of this, we'll have some sort of OpenXR type API, because we don't really want an ARIA patch where HTML for the web is accessible, but some parts aren't. So we needed ARIA to come in the front. We want this all to be born accessible and be accessible from the start. And one of the things to help us with that is we really need to start thinking about the accessible object models. So by doing all of these things, we're going to be able to make AR and VR experiences much more accessible and easy to do in the future. So get started today. Start doing some research. Start doing experimentation. Join the group. It's a great experience to be in. We do have some high-level guidelines, and we can do some bits of augmented and virtual reality accessibility today. So thank you all for coming to my talk, and I will open up the floor to any questions.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for that awesome presentation. This really is an exciting time in technology. I'm looking forward to seeing all the amazing stuff coming out. I definitely know we got a lot of ground to cover with accessibility here, but there've been some great questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to bring some of those up. One of the top questions here: are there any screen readers or equivalent at all for XR, even in research stage? If so, what researchers, if any, are working on this?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I'm assuming that some people are working on it, but I'm not sure who. That would be actually a good question to ask in the XR Access community. I know one of the things that I've heard from especially Oculus is that without the desktop application, it's really hard to open up any sort of VR application. But when we're using something like mobile AR, we are able to get that screen reader inside of there. So it depends on what platform you're doing. If you're doing web, you do have JAWS, you do have NVDA, you do have VoiceOver. But if you're doing a VR headset specifically, I'm not aware of anything at the moment.
Gotcha. So another question here is, Sabrina says, I was part of a VR test group last year. It was not accessible. What should I do next time?
Ooh, I think this depends on what you're talking about. Was there anything that they were doing? Was there anything specific? If people aren't creating their experiences accessibly, I would ask them, hey, can you please go back and do this in order to have us be able to participate? So some really low-hanging, I say low-hanging fruit, but we don't actually know how to do everything correctly at the moment. It's going to be user feedback and iterations. Make sure that we have an option to have on captioning. Make sure that we have someone to be able to at least do a live audio description in an experience. Make sure that we have just a way to turn off some content and noise. Those are just some really lowish hanging fruits.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess following up with that, it sounds like there may be opportunities to get involved, right? So can you point us in any direction for how to connect and get involved in these communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So the one that I always push people towards is XR Access. So if you Google XR Access, there's a sign up link. The community is very welcoming. We would love to have you part of it. So do go there. There's a few people also in the XR Access community that also do the immersive captioning group and the inclusive design for web with the W3C. And inside of that, we also have the A11Y VR meetup, which is on meetup.com. So do feel free to reach out to any of those groups. You'll see a lot of crossover of the people, so you'll get to know quite a few people very quickly.
That's awesome. Yeah. There are communities out there, and it takes everybody, right? It takes us in the audience and us in the professional industry getting involved, adding your input. So absolutely would recommend, if you got some time to spend and effort, your insight matters. So please do join in on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think one of the things is if we don't start doing iterations and feedback with people, we're never going to get this correct. So we want, even though we're at a good-ish state with web and mobile, we want to be even better with AR and VR in the future, because this is going to be a new technology that everyone's going to use in the future, but we want everyone to be able to use it. So if we start now, we'll get it right.
I completely agree, and this actually brings up another Q&A that Robin sent in. Robin says, given how bad web accessibility still is, even after 30 years, do you expect XR to do better in the near future? Right? Can we change this? Can we make it better before?
I have high hopes. So hopefully we'll see. I do know that one of the big tenets is that we want technology to be born accessible. So this really means that once we get the form factor correct, so the headsets aren't bulky, it's really easy to use, it's quite seamless, like what we have for the web or for mobile. We really want to make sure that everything is accessible coming out of that. And one way to do this is really to start getting involved with the different communities as well as the different organizations. So things like Oculus, Vive, making sure that we're in the hardware manufacturing, the software, Unity especially. I would love to see more accessibility options when we're creating AR and VR experiences in Unity. So if you have something that it's like placing your transform, but it's automatically doing that for alternative text for a 3D object. Just making sure that we have all these options as we're developing.
Absolutely. Are there accepted specific considerations for users as far as 3D and FOV?
So
I'd say for monocular users.
So I don't know if there's anything that is set in stone at the moment. We still have different things going on about 3D content and field of view. We don't really know anything. I would say that all this stuff is subject to change just because the pace of the technology at the moment is very quick. So it seems like almost every year a new headset's coming out, or every couple of months something else has come out in the AR VR industry. So I don't know of anything at the moment, but I'm sure that it'll come. Yeah.
Yep. And again, I mean, that just brings us back to the community involvement, right? The change that is going to make, or the impact we can make and change we can make, it comes from the community. So, it does take it takes a community to make that happen. Definitely get involved. All right, here we go. I got another one. How could XR installations in museums curate more accessible experiences for each attendee? Maybe customized design for individuals through user feedback?
So AR and VR accessibility inside museums is one of my favorite things to talk about. And if you want, please reach out to me. I will go way more in depth into this. I think inside of this, what we really need to do is make sure that we're going to be thinking about different users as we're creating them. So at the moment inside of museums, what we do is a lot of augmented reality. So when I go to an object, I have to physically scan that object. But by taking the augmented reality experience and changing it so that we have the ability to do something like our location-based sensors, that can be a little bit tricky, but we can do things with computer vision, making sure that we are able to read signs as we're going across experience, like across the atrium. being able to understand where we're at using computer vision, we can easily tell the user, okay, here's what's going on. Give an audio tour, give a haptic tour. We have so many considerations to think about. And I think part of this also goes into what museums currently do as well. So currently inside of a museum, a lot of information you get is just visual. Some museums are doing really well at doing things like audio tours, but we don't really have that very well at the moment. So I think inside of this, especially when we're thinking about using augmented reality in the future, where we have just glasses to put on, being able to have that visual, being able to have the sound, being able to have haptics, it's going to help us out so much more than what we have currently.
Absolutely. It's exciting. I really love that. There are so many cool things out there, right? So many cool opportunities. This feels like a very young and new field, I guess. So I don't know. I guess one question I have for you is, how long before we see this really rolling out to the masses?
Oh, that's a very tricky question. I honestly would say that some of it is ready today, but not really. So we have things like doing our mobile augmented reality. We have Google, which when you Google certain animals or historical sites, I believe also you can do like dinosaurs. You can put that inside of augmented reality, but it doesn't understand your location and it doesn't understand the spatial awareness around you. So I think that bit needs to really get inside of it. And we have companies like Niantic who are working a lot with this. And I think once they get to a point where they have essentially mapped the world, then we're going to see it being able to be rolled out to more people. But until we have something that looks like what we see on TV, people are going to be very hesitant. But at the moment, we do have really good use cases. So things like trainings. We see a lot of people using virtual reality, especially for training. So when I think it was surgeons who use VR training are 6 times less likely to make mistakes inside of surgeries than those who don't. I believe that's statistic. If it's not, I apologize. I can't remember numbers off the top of my head. But it's so fascinating to see how the training actually helps people do better at their job, perform better. They can do much quicker. There's a lot of research being done about that. So I think the masses and for consumer adoption, we're still waiting for the technology to really get smaller to a point where it's easier to use. We're kind of in the Nokia stage of with the mobile phones. So we have this really bulky headset, but pretty soon we'll get our iPhone and then it'll be easier and we'll eventually get down the road.
I love that analogy. That is awesome. Let's hope soon. I mean, the future is unlimited, right? So cool. Well, we don't have any more Q&A. At this point, I think we'll just end a little bit early. Deb, really appreciate you joining, and everyone in the audience, thank you for taking the time. We've got so much great feedback in the chat and Q&A here. Again, Deb, thank you, and like to say, Whitney and Hay, our ASL interpreters, thank you very, very much. And also to Connor on our production team.
Thank you all.